Hello, class. This is a continuation of today's lesson on Joshua, Judges, and Ruth, and we're picking it up on an overview of the book of Judges. And you can see there on the PowerPoint what we've already covered. And I want to move into what point 2 is on the overview, which covers chapter 2, verse 6, all the way through chapter 16, verse 31. And that section can be encapsulated by the heading that there was amongst the Israelites covenant disobedience and judgment that they experienced as a result. And here's what we see happening in the book of Judges. 6 times there is a pattern that repeats. 6 times. Just keep that in mind as we lay out what that pattern is. First, we see Israel committing a sin. And then secondly, war is commenced on Israel as judgment from God. God allows the neighboring powers to attack them. That's a consequence of their sin. Then Israel, realizing how they have gone off track, repents. They say, God, we're sorry. Please take us back. And indeed, Israel is delivered from their enemies, from their own consequence of their own sin, by raising up a judge who would deliver them. And this is repeated 6 different times in this section alone. So that makes you think and wonder what exactly was going through their minds when they would go through this cycle again. And there's one more step to the pattern that I want to highlight. And it's that Israel enjoys peace for a time. And isn't this an often repeated version of how we can sometimes live our life with God? We sin, we experience a consequence, we cry out for help. We know we don't deserve it, but we receive his help. And then we are delivered. And then after a season of things going well, we return to sin. And the whole process is repeated. So when you think about the incomplete conquest, when you think about the covenant disobedience, you realize there's lots going on here that needs fixing. The work of salvation is not fully complete, not because of God's inability, but because of the lack of compliance on the part of the Israelites. There's one final section, though, I want to highlight, and that is the rest of the book in chapter 17 through 21, which can be characterized by the heading, The Collapse of Israelite Society. Now, one of the things that plagued the Israelites was a lack of leadership again and again. In fact, there's a phrase, in those days, Israel had no king, which was repeated several times to underscore this lack of leadership. We see it in chapter 17, in chapter 18, in chapter 19, in chapter 21, this same phrase. In those days, Israel had no king. In addition to the lack of leadership, there was a great deal of moral relativism, which can be summed up by this phrase, that everyone did what was right in their own eyes. We see this phrase repeated in chapters 17 and chapter 21. And together, these two things are the primary cause of, or causes, I should say, of Israel's downfall. But now, on the heels of that, in the context of how the Israelites are struggling, we zero in on the particular story of Ruth. And so let's take a look at what's happening in Ruth. Just 4 chapters. The period of the Judges is the historical context for Ruth. And so that's one of the reasons why Ruth follows the book of Judges. But I just want to summarize things up here by each chapter. Naomi and Ruth obviously returned to Bethlehem after a series of just terrible incidences in their lives, losing husbands and Naomi losing her sons. And Ruth, of course, one of those sons was her husband. And Ruth commits herself to be with Naomi, even though she is not an Israelite herself. In fact, in those days, marriage was the only source of stability and security for a woman in the ancient Middle East. So it would have made more sense for her to have left, for Ruth to have left Naomi and gone out on her own, gone back to Moab, in fact. But there was something that she saw in her husband, in her father-in-law in her mother-in-law that drew her to stay with the Israelite community. She goes back to Bethlehem, as we have already said, and in chapter 2, she gleans in the field of Boaz. There's an ancient practice that's detailed in Leviticus chapters 19 and 23, where the edges of a field are not harvested so that those who have less means are able to pick grain for themselves on the edges of the field. And that's exactly what Ruth did. She didn't receive a handout. She worked for what she had. And another concept that needs to be unpacked is that of kinsman redeemer. And the kinsman redeemer is someone that Boaz turns out to be. A kinsman redeemer was responsible for redeeming the property and restoring it to the original family owner. And in those days, a wife was deemed as a property. And so we move on to chapter 3, where Ruth makes an interesting request of Boaz. She, in fact, requests marriage. This is not out of love. This is out of survival. And she asks Boaz to serve as her kinsman redeemer. Now, this is a practice, again, that the Israelites had. Gleaning was a practice that the Israelites had. These are provisions that God put in place to care for those who are on the fringes of life, like Ruth and Naomi. Which leads us to what happens in chapter 4, which is that Ruth and Boaz end up getting married. What we see happening is that women who had lost everything, who were extremely vulnerable, end up being provided for. And not only are they provided for, but in addition, Ruth gives birth to a child, Obed. And who is Obed? Well, Obed happens to be the grandfather of King David. And so here's what we learn from this. Here's kind of the interpretation of this particular book. This has messianic importance and meaning. Ruth is in fact mentioned in Matthew's ancestral list for Jesus, if you go to Matthew chapter 1, verse 5. And then secondly, all of these events, all of these things emphasize how God is sovereign and the importance of living faithfully. All of these things put together underscore the goodness of God and his ability to save even in the worst of circumstances.